Every December 15th, people celebrate a little-known holiday known as the Bill of Rights Day. Although it's not a major holiday, liberty supporters and fans of American history make a note of the anniversary each year. The Bill of Rights was adopted in 1789 and it contains the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. These changes were written just 8 days after the earlier founding document. It was adopted to appease anti-federalists who may not have otherwise supported ratification of the Constitution. These amendments are meant to restrict power exercised by the national government. Many people are now concerned that actions by governing bodies at all levels are violating human rights guaranteed by that document. Other observers contend that modern concerns like terrorism and increasingly deadly weapons make parts of the bill obsolete. Shahid Buttar is a civil rights lawyer, author, and community organizer. He's the head of the Bill of Rights Defense Committee and is co-director of the Rule of Law Institute. Buttar is our guest on the show today. He's here to talk to us about Bill of Rights Day and what the document means for Americans and what has happened to civil liberties. Welcome back to the program, Shahid.
Thanks for having me on, Gary.
Shahid, why is the Bill of Rights important to Americans in your view?
This is really the cornerstone of our freedom. The Bill of Rights was set up historically to ensure that the Constitution would not only set up the parameters for the interplay between the different branches of government, but that it would also protect we the people from those different branches of government. It is the linchpin on which freedom rests. Without, for instance, the right to speech or assembly or the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, we can't be sure that we will have the opportunity to raise our voices as citizens, independent citizens in a republic. And in fact, we have lost all of those particular rights.
And I want to ask you about that. How have protections changed in the nearly 2.25 centuries since the document was adopted?
Yeah, great question. And it's basically been a death by 1,000 cuts, accelerated very dramatically in the last decade since the 9/11 attacks. This year, the NSA spying dragnet has been very much in the center of the news. And that was basically created in secret under the Bush administration, outside the parameters of any allowed legal structure, in direct contravention of a statute passed by Congress in the 1970s, the last time Congress investigated the intelligence establishment. Then, once it was unearthed in 2005 by the press, the law was changed. Well, the program was unearthed, I should say. Then the law was changed by Congress in 2008 precisely to permit everything that it had originally acted to prohibit. And so there you see the executive branch starting, Congress then continuing an expansion of executive power. And anytime executive power expands, it means that individual rights contract. They run in tension with each other. And in this case, it was not only the executive violating the law and the Constitution in secret, but then Congress getting in on the act. And the courts have also had opportunities to restrain the NSA's program in particular. Every federal judge that has ever reached the merits of the question has ruled the NSA's program to be unconstitutional. But the last time the Supreme Court looked at it, it ruled that it couldn't issue a ruling.
Shahid, what's the motivation behind this?
Behind the NSA's program?
Well,
or the expansion of executive power more generally?
All of this.
Well, it's a complicated question. The expansion of executive power, I fear, might be inherent in the office of the president. This is one of the things that President Eisenhower spoke about when he left office in 1961, having served as the Supreme Allied Commander in World War II. He warned the American people that in the wake of World War II, there was emerging, in his words, a military-industrial complex. That is to say, members of Congress beholden to weapons manufacturers for campaign contributions, the weapons manufacturers themselves, the military, and all of the, not just the contractors, but the different military components in between the Defense Department, the various weapons contractors, and Congress. Ike was worried that democracies in America, its greatest threat would be internal. And for that reason, many of our founding fathers thought the same thing. I don't think they envisioned a military-industrial complex, but they feared that the greatest threat to the Constitution would be an internal one.
Well, you mentioned that the expansion of the executive power. Did the founders put a specific check to prevent what is happening today in our founding documents, aside from the separation of power that the document initiates?
Absolutely. That's what the Bill of Rights was supposed to be. The Fourth Amendment to the Constitution states in no uncertain terms that we the people shall be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, and that warrants will only issue upon probable cause.
So then why is it that the executive branch continues to grow in size and power? And we're not talking just about the Obama administration. This goes back administration after administration.
Absolutely. It's inherent in the modern office of the president. And I think the main reasons are that, A, presidents get away with it, and they keep a lot of things in secret, hidden from the public, the press, and Congress. 2, that Congress gets co-opted, led to chase its own tail. At the moment, for instance, we're seeing a congressional debate over more than 24 competing proposals to restrain NSA abuses, and even the ones that are the most significant themselves are very resignatory. And meanwhile, we're fighting the administration to simply accept any meaningful reforms to the process. The Global Signals Intelligence Review Group is reporting apparently next week, and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times reported today that its findings and its recommendations will be quite meager and not at all sufficient to meet the concerns that emerged in the wake of the Snowden leaks. And so intra-executive processes can't be relied upon. The congressional check has been weak, and the courts have really marginalized themselves, either by creating and then extending the state secrets doctrine, or by passing jurisprudentially very narrow constitutional standing decisions like Clapper versus Amnesty International, the last case that the Supreme Court heard about NSA spying.
This brings me to my next question, because there are critics out there that say the Bill of Rights and certain elements of the Constitution are flat out outdated. Is there any merit to that, given the vast expansion of spying, given the vast advancements and growth of the executive branch in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, someone might claim that the Bill of Rights is outdated, but that would make them very non-American. I mean, that's a very Soviet claim. The idea that you can just throw out the baby with the proverbial bathwater. The Constitution is the founding document of our country. It constitutes the republic.
Well, Feinstein wants to define journalism. She also wants to get rid of the Second Amendment. I mean, there's so many people in Washington, D.C. that are plotting and planning to introduce laws and statutes that would go ahead and limit those individual rights in the Bill of Rights. So what is their motivation to do so?
I mean, the motivation, I think, really, I go back to Eisenhower's speech. I mean, this is what it looks like when the military and weapons manufacturers dictate domestic policy. And now the military-industrial complex has metastasized so that it includes the telecom industry, which is making hand over fist from taxpayer dollars being used to buy individual data, or in other cases, outright hacking those companies. So sort of hijacking what could be data streams. It's the profit motive ultimately, and the corporate collusion with government programs that creates this institutional incentive to degrade individual rights that don't have a procedural vehicle to find expression.
So corporate profits, you believe, are largely behind some of these motivations?
I mean, motivation is hard to guess because we're talking about institutions. There certainly is a lot of corporate money here. And to the extent you're inclined to follow the money to discover the source of the problem, that's one thing you find at the end of this very dark rainbow. But the other reason, and I don't want to leave this on the table, this is a little bit nefarious, and I wouldn't chalk this up to anyone in the Obama or even the Bush administration, but this is the nature of executive power. It doesn't have to be wielded only by the chief executive. Unfortunately, the executive branch benefits the more power it has. And that can be, you can see that through an innocuous lens. Now this means that police can catch more criminals. There's also a very nefarious lens to look at that through, and that looks like this. Now some two-bit prosecutor from county X, Y, or Z can find out everything embarrassing that their political opponents have ever done and use that to preserve their own entrenchment in office. And that's been one of the reasons we've been so concerned about civil liberties in our nation's history, is that we have created very powerful executive offices, and it takes the restraints in the Bill of Rights and the separation of powers to ensure that those offices are wielded responsibly, and so that their powers are not used for the individual ends of whoever happens to fill those offices. And LoveInt is a really interesting example to look at here. The NSA has discovered that at least on dozens of occasions, NSA agents have used the agency's very powerful tools to spy not on foreign governments, not even on just anyone among the American people, but particularly their ex-wives and former lovers. And that is exactly why the Constitution was set up, so that government officials don't act like these powers are theirs rather than we the people's entrusted to them.
Shahid, do you believe that the NSA spying is the grossest violation of the Bill of Rights currently happening in this country, or is there something worse?
There's certainly no question that it is, that is to say, the NSA's activities violate the Constitution. I don't think there's any credible claim to the contrary. People at the NSA will say that they're complying with the Constitution, but of course that requires redefining search to mean something other than the collection of your data. So it just flies in the face of common sense. Are there worse abuses? It really depends on what you consider worse. It is certainly true that if you're, let's say, an environmentalist, and you stand on the street corner outside the home of someone who runs a life sciences company, let's say they experiment on, animals or monkeys, and let's say that you're holding a sign on that street corner that says, "Let the monkeys go," there is a law passed in the 90s before the 9/11 attacks, making that an act of not speech constitutionally protected, but rather terrorism. And at least 30% of the federal terror defendants who have been, or not even defendants, but convicts, people who've been convicted of terror offenses, they are young white men from the Pacific Northwest who basically committed environmentally motivated acts of vandalism, or in the worst cases, arson. But they're all convicted terrorists now. Is that a worse abuse of the Bill of Rights and speech and assembly than tapping the back end of the phone system and the internet and monitoring everyone in the country? I mean, it's hard to say what's worse, but there are plenty of violations to go around. One that's also worth noting is torture with impunity. We have an Eighth Amendment that says that people will not be subjected to cruel and unusual punishment as a matter of their rights. The government does not have the ability to disregard that. However, we know that torture was committed under the Bush administration as a method of interrogation, and that no one has ever been held responsible for those crimes, which prompted the deaths of U.S. service members killed by militants driven to struggle by legitimate human rights concerns around torture. B, we know that torture continues at Guantanamo Bay today, not as a method of interrogation, but rather through force feeding. C, we know that torture is pervasive and endemic across the U.S. prison system.
Well, Shahid, does the administration justify torture because the individuals being tortured are not American citizens and therefore not afforded the protections in the Bill of Rights or Constitution?
That's the issue. In U.S. prisons every day, people are held in solitary confinement for weeks and months and years. And solitary confinement over 2 weeks has been acknowledged as a form of torture for decades. And those are U.S. citizens. I mean, those are people who are not in jail for terror offenses. I mean, we're talking about people rounded up often through racial profiling and the war on drugs, and they're in prison there's some great documentaries out about this now, and the idea of solitary confinement as a locus of torture is also well established. The city of Chicago passed a municipal resolution to this effect in the spring of 2010.
Shahid, hold that thought. We have to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to discuss the Bill of Rights Day that's coming up after the break.